All COVID restrictions are coming to an end, including self-isolation when you're positive. Boris Johnson has announced today that that is set to be a reality from the end of this month. Is this how we learn to live with COVID? Is this the freedom that vaccinations has given us? Or is this a desperate attempt by a politician to try and save his career, which could prove very damaging for the rest of us? That's the question we'll be answering tonight. I'm joined all evening by Dalia Gebrial. How are you doing, Dalia?
I'm doing good, Michael. How are you doing?
I am very well. I'm kind of glad that there was a while where every episode where we didn't talk about COVID, I was like, this is amazing. We're having a show about COVID, but we haven't talked about it for such a long time that now I'm actually glad we get to go back to all of those graphs. I have mixed feelings about this announcement today. Tonight, we are also going to be talking about the fallout from the mob harassing Keir Starmer, more Downing Street party picks, Sadiq Khan going in on Cressida Dick, and Boris Johnson's kind of wrong and hires who he has promoted in his team. We do want to know your comments and your questions. You can tweet them on the hashtag TiskiSour or put them in the comments box. Before Prime Minister's questions this lunchtime, Boris Johnson needed a headline-grabbing announcement to raise the spirits of his mutinous MPs. He chose this.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell the House today that it is my intention to return on the first day after the half-term recess to present our strategy for living with COVID. Provided the current encouraging trends in the data continue, it is my expectation that we will be able to end the last domestic restrictions, including the legal requirement to self-isolate if you test positive, a full month early, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, all remaining restrictions in England are set to end, and that includes the requirement to self-isolate after a positive test. That has been brought forward from the end of March when all COVID legislation was due to expire. So that would have expired without any decision being made in Parliament. Given the hold COVID rules have had over our lives for the past 2 years, this is a pretty big deal. But is it an announcement driven by science or by politics? This is what Robert Peston had to say. No one in or around Sage and NerveTag is aware of any scientific advice given to the PM that the requirement to isolate for those infected with COVID-19 should be terminated from end of the month. It's politics, isn't it? He says that's a typical reaction. Christina Pagel of Indie Sage agrees. She says, dropping isolation makes work and socialising riskier and boosters are waning. COVID keeps evolving and it's harder to know about local case levels. Basically, government plan that we will all get COVID several times, like a cold, but with a much more dangerous disease, not science-based. Personally, I have no doubt whatsoever this was a decision driven by politics, not by science, or indeed any other idea regarding societal happiness. This was an attempt by Boris Johnson to please his backbench MPs. They have, at every stage in this pandemic, opposed public health measures. And while Boris Johnson was correct that COVID data is moving in the right direction, the stats really aren't particularly reassuring. Confirmed cases are well below their peak, but remain high. Part of that decline may also be down to reduced testing. The ONS, which does a weekly infection survey, suggests cases might actually be rising again. So some uncertainty there. One thing we can be sure of, hospitalizations are on the way down, but over 1,000 admissions a day is not a great place to be, even if many of those will be patients admitted with COVID instead of admitted because of it. Finally, deaths, while relatively low when compared to the rest of the pandemic, the daily figures are still significant. Around 200 people are still dying every day with COVID mentioned on their death certificate. All that said, there are arguments as to why it might be time to consider ending all legally mandated restrictions. Thanks to vaccination and Omicron being less severe, the risk of ending up in ICU is now tiny compared to earlier in the pandemic. A recent French study suggests that while an unvaccinated 70-year-old with Delta would have had a 7% chance of needing treatment in ICU, for a boosted 70-year-old with Omicron, that figure drops to 0.25%. Another study, this time using ONS statistics, compared flu to Omicron before and after vaccination. In mid-2020, for someone over 60, COVID was at least 13 times more deadly than flu. By early 2022, so that's with widespread vaccination and with Omicron dominant. COVID was still deadlier than flu, but only by double the amount. Finally, if England does go ahead with dropping all restrictions, it will not be the first country to do so. South Africa dropped the requirement for asymptomatic COVID-positive people to self-isolate at the end of last month, and Denmark has now dropped the legal requirement for anyone with COVID to self-isolate. They still advise you to do it, but you're not breaking the law if you don't. To discuss Johnson's announcement, I'm now joined by Oliver Barnes, health and science reporter at the FT, the papers whose graphs, as you can tell, I am just constantly stealing for this show. Welcome back to Tiski Sauer. So the question that's framed this, do you think, from your perspective, this is driven by politics or science, this decision to end even self-isolation at the end of this month?
Well, I think the framing of the announcement today at PMQs was clearly a political element to it, right? The Coronavirus Act was put into law, I think, on the 25th of March, 2020, and it hasn't gone anywhere ever since. And it looks good for Johnson to play to his kind of more libertarian wing of his party to say we're getting rid of the legal underpinnings to self-isolation requirements. Now, the kind of science of it, I think, is to be determined, because when recess ends and Parliament returns in a week or so's time, we're going to understand what the guidance looks like, i.e. what the official advice from the UK Health Security Agency is. I expect that will probably still be to self-isolate if you can. And then also the effect that this will have on measures like the self-isolation payment scheme, where certain people on lower salaries can get access to a £500 stipend to help them self-isolate, and also the impact this will have on the funding for testing. All of that is kind of to be determined. And I think that will end up maybe having a bigger effect on this than just the move from a legislative approach to a kind of advice guidance-based approach.
Yeah, I suppose there's two directions this could go in. One is to say, not that much changes, but we're taking away the force of the law. I mean, you can argue, I think, quite powerfully that, in an extreme circumstance where this was 13 times as deadly as flu, then having laws that we would usually have thought of as quite authoritarian, you have to stay in your house so that you don't pass on a disease, they were justified when it's only twice as dangerous as flu. Maybe we can do this voluntarily. So it could just be moving it, as you say, from being mandated to being advised. Or this could be the beginning of a completely different approach to Omicron and to COVID more generally, which is where we say, we're just going to stop thinking about it. We're going to stop getting tested. If you're not that ill, you don't really need to know. If you pass it on, it's not that big a deal. Better if you don't, but not the end of the world if you do. And so we just start treating it like any other virus, which we don't normally test for. We just sort of think, well, I might have the flu, I might have a cold, whatever, let's get on with it. Do you think this is more the former or the latter? Is this a massive change, or is this just a shift from it being legislative to it being advisory?
Well, I think there are definitely driving factors towards the latter, right? I can't imagine that the Treasury is going to be hugely comfortable with paying £37 billion every 2 years towards test and trace, ad infinitum. So I expect there's some kind of pressure. And obviously that libertarian wing of the party that wants these restrictions to end probably also wants a kind of smaller government budget too. So I imagine there's going to be pressure heading in that direction to start crunching down the test and trace system as well. I think Denmark and Sweden are interesting kind of leading indicators on this, because Sweden's dropped a whole suite of restrictions today. Denmark made the move at the beginning of February. What Denmark did was get rid of the legal underpinnings for the self-isolation rules. So now it's strongly encouraged, and obviously there's high levels of government trust and compliance in Denmark and good sick pay, so a lot of people are still doing it. But what Denmark retained was a fairly large chunk of its PCR testing system. It's kind of reduced the amount of lateral flow tests available, but you can still get a PCR test quite easily. When in Sweden, I think they've kept the kind of strong advice. They never actually had laws underpinning their self-isolation rules, but they've kept strong advice, but they've got rid of large swathes of their testing system. And I think the suspicion might be that, given those factors of trying to push down the spending on the pandemic, and also the kind of let it rip mentality of certain portions of the Conservative Party, that we may end up with that approach, which would involve, kind of forgetting about COVID. That would not be scientifically smart. I think the main thing too is that you'd also want to leave an infrastructure in place that if there were to be another variant emerge later in the year, or we have waning immunity and we start to see a pickup in infections again, you can easily rebuild that infrastructure almost overnight.
I mean, there are some public health officials and scientists who kind of do seem to say, who I don't think come from the sort of cynical perspective of we want to reduce the cost to the Treasury, whatever the consequences. People like Alison Pollock or Francois Ballou, sort of people who are saying we need to move beyond this. We're treating this in a way more seriously than it needs to be treated, given the situation we're in, given what the disease looks like at this point in time. Is that still a fringe opinion? In contact with people who are on SAGE or various government advisors, is that still something which is very much a fringe opinion, just to say let's just properly live with it to the extent of basically forgetting about it?
I suspect most people, I speak to people on SAGE quite often, and also on some of the other government advisory committees. They're human beings as well, and they're aware that kind of normality existed for a reason, right? We human beings interact. We want to spend time with other people. We can't forever restrain our behaviors in relation to an infectious disease that's having less of an effect on our hospitals, causing less severe disease. So I expect the approach that they would want is probably quite a balanced one. What the tweet from Robert Peston said earlier, that SAGE hadn't discussed this, there hasn't been active discussion of dropping these measures, but there was going to be, because these measures were expiring on March the 24th. What Johnson's move does is bring the expiration forward to the end of February instead. And I expect that a lot of members of SAGE would have seen that March 24th expiry date for the Coronavirus Act and assumed that the government was probably going to push ahead with that. So what they'll want to understand is what the picture looks like afterwards and what the recommendation looks like coming from the UK Health Security Agency. Ultimately, a lot of people don't self-isolate now, right? There's a lot of asymptomatic infections, so no one ever clocks if they have COVID and they're walking around spreading COVID. There's also a number of people who, because of their employment circumstances, don't end up self-isolating. So we're really looking at the chunk who currently do, and we're wondering how many of those will still do so, once it moves from legislative approach to advice-based approach. And that's kind of, to be determined. An indicator on that, though, which I think is interesting, and obviously this took place within the kind of emergency Omicron response in December, but all the lateral flow testing stuff in relation to going and visiting your relatives, elderly relatives, take a lateral flow test, none of that was legally mandated. And people did it and did it a lot. And I expect that there's certain behaviors we've picked up, and people on SAGE and SPIBE, the Behavioral Modelling Committee, would be aware of this. There's certain behaviors that we've picked up over the course of the last 2 years that we're just not going to shake overnight, because people are aware of that personal risk calculation now more than ever. So in us kind of learning to live with the virus, it really kind of seems to mean a move from this kind of collective legislative-based, top-down approach to people making more individual risk assessments and decisions.
I want to go to a tweet. This is from Araminti. They say, bizarre decision. I'm triple jabbed and caught COVID from someone who was triple jabbed. I was really unwell for 3 days, and now on day 8, I'm still testing positive. Imagine how many I could have infected, some vulnerable, if I hadn't stayed home. I think for lots of people that is quite a common experience. You could also say, you were sick for 3 days and now you're still testing positive. Would that have been similar with flu? The bit I want to focus on, though, because this is the thing I think we do need to, always take most seriously, is what you put in brackets. We could, or you could have, if you hadn't isolated, passed this on to vulnerable people. And Oliver, you saw at the, in my introduction, I showed actually some of the Financial Times graphs about how risks had fallen for. The test case in that example was a 70-year-old. What about people who, we used to call at the start of the pandemic clinically extremely vulnerable? I think they got rid of that category, but people who could be any age, but who have particular conditions, which mean that they are understandably still very, very concerned about catching COVID, and so are very worried about announcements like this. What is the latest data telling us on the risks to people with conditions that make them especially vulnerable to a virus like coronavirus?
Can I just touch on Aaron's tweet really quickly, because I think it raises an important point. the question that I have after that is, would he still isolate in the future when the law changes? And, some people, I don't know what his job is, but if he works in a kind of nice white collar job where they enable him to do so, he might still be able to. So therefore, it doesn't change much. Does he work for someone where they would force him to come in? Then it does change it. And that's how, when we see it shake out, that's the effect that's kind of significant. The second point you raised, though, Michael, I think is a really important one, and we can't ignore it, which is there were 3 million people on the shielding list who were classified as clinically extremely vulnerable. They were deigned to be, at severe risk of COVID. The vaccines will have reduced that risk, but because they started with a higher risk, that relative reduction still means they have quite a substantial risk. That's obviously also the case for older generations. Throughout the Omicron wave, the infection rates amongst the very oldest, fortunately, have been the lowest of anyone in society. If they are now exposed to people on a more regular basis who are infectious, that would not be good and would be concerning for them. I think the group that it's most unpleasant for, though, is the 500,000 or so immunosuppressed people who might have got transplants or be on chemotherapy. These groups generally haven't responded really at all, many of them, to the vaccinations. And that's why the guidance, as it is in the UK, is that actually they can get a 4th vaccine dose. And that's on the basis of just the assumption that, if they're not responding to 2, let's give them 3, let's give them an extra one on top of that, let's give them 4. And we don't know how much protection they'll have from vaccination. I expect there'll be a huge degree of anxiety around that. And that's why ultimately, as we, the big debate at the moment, or at least in the pieces that I've been writing, is about this kind of when we can start to think of COVID as an endemic disease. And, endemic doesn't mean mild. It doesn't mean no impact on people. And this is ultimately why it kind of boils down to something beyond science. It's something maybe even beyond politics. It's kind of philosophical almost, which is how much tens of millions of people in society should adjust their risk for a smaller group in society. And people clearly have very, very different perspectives on the degree to which we should do so. I would guess a lot of people, once we move beyond the laws, will still do things that benefit, the people who are still vulnerable. By which I mean a lot of people will still stay at home when they're infectious, and they'll probably do so for other viruses now, like flu, when they didn't beforehand. And I expect there'll still be quite high levels of masking. The masks are no longer legally mandated in a lot of public places at the moment. You still see people using them. At the moment, obviously, they're still encouraged on the tube and on TfL in London. At some point, that maybe goes, and people will still use them nonetheless. So again, it's going to be interesting to see how many of these measures built around improving. Built around protecting the most vulnerable in society, how many people decide to take forward individually.
Oliver Barnes, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Very interesting, very balanced. I'm sure we'll get you back on soon, I suppose, depending on what happens next, depending on how seriously we do just sort of forget about the virus. I'm sure we won't be forgetting about it to the extent that we won't need expert guests on it anymore. We'll speak soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Let's go to a couple of comments before we move on to our next story. Named for Mars says, living with the virus is dangerous nonsense. Long COVID exists. Are you expecting to live with that indefinitely? Very interesting point. Something that annoys me, frustrates me, I suppose, with some of the reporting on long COVID is we're often told this many people have long COVID and they've been living with it for this amount of time. And my absolute solidarity for anyone living with long COVID. Obviously there's a huge spectrum. Long COVID can mean that you feel a bit under the weather for more than 4 weeks, or it can mean that you've got a debilitating condition for over a year. So it's the numbers on it I always find quite hard to unpack, especially because it doesn't always tell you which ones were infections which were acquired before the vaccines and which were acquired afterwards. But absolutely an issue we need to be always aware of. Laura Martin says, vaccinate the rest of the world before we talk about living with the virus. I 100% agree with vaccinate the rest of the world. I suppose you could say, are those two things opposed? I'm not entirely sure they are, but definitely vaccinating the world should be our top priority. Let's go to our next story. Boris Johnson is desperate to move on from the row about his lockdown parties, but that effort keeps being interrupted by the leaking of new photos. And that has happened again, right in the middle of PMQs. This is the photo in question. So that was leaked to the Mirror. And at first, when this was published, I thought it was, relatively weak source. We already knew Boris Johnson hosted a Christmas quiz in December 2020. We already knew it was breaking the rules because he's with people outside his household for a social event. But to me, it never looked as brazen as some of the other examples. The quiz was on Zoom. It didn't look like they'd just forgotten that COVID existed. And for me, an open bottle of Prosecco doesn't change that much. However, a video has been brought to my attention that puts the image in a slightly different light. This is Nadeem Zahawi justifying the quiz, speaking last December.
I have to say to you, you just mentioned the quiz night and that picture today. What do we see in that picture? We see a prime minister on a virtual quiz night for 10 to 15 minutes to thank his staff, who, by the way, had no choice but to come in every single day. Let me just finish this point, right? Sitting in his office with the two people who are closest working with him, no alcohol on the table, not drinking, right? On a Zoom call or a Teams call, on virtual call, respecting the lockdown rules.
No alcohol on the table. Very, very awkward. Dalia, what was your reaction to that picture? Does it change things for you that there was an open bottle of Prosecco on the table?
I mean, no, I think we've heard enough now to know exactly what the situation was. And the question isn't about, was there an open bottle of Prosecco or was there, drinking at this particular event? What we know is that a significant amount of gathering, of mixing that regular people would have, and many regular people did actually end up being prosecuted for, was happening at the very top. And so this particular picture or any other kinds of specific snapshots that we might have access to doesn't actually make the difference, because the actual thrust of the truth and the thing that's important, which is that the government was breaking their own rules, breaking rules that ordinary people, regular people were being punished for, and also breaking rules in a way that could have, could have meant that people got infected with a virus and then spread that out into their communities. And we also know the contempt and the recklessness with which Boris Johnson led us throughout the pandemic, particularly in those early stages, but also in addition to his own personal breaking of those rules. So the details at this point, with the amount that we do know, the details are irrelevant and sucking us into the specificities of the details, which is what Nadeem, sorry, I've forgotten his surname there, my brain just blanked, is, and his advisors and other people who are coming out to bat for him. That's sort of much more in their interest, because it distracts us from the broader thrust, which is undebatable, frankly, at this point.
Nadeem Zahawi, that was the surname you were looking for, who presumably feels a little bit embarrassed now that he was sent out on Sky to say it was all fine because there was no alcohol on the table. And now we know one thing there definitively was alcohol on the table. Let's move on to the other big Boris Johnson story of the week. When deciding whether to falsely imply Keir Starmer had protected Jimmy Savile, Boris Johnson faced a dilemma. On the one hand, whether or not the slur was true, Johnson wanted members of the public to have that association in the back of their minds. On the other, if it became too obvious what Johnson was doing and who he was appealing to, the stunt could backfire. As we know, Boris Johnson would ultimately take the risk, and he may be happy that Starmer and Savile are now two names often said in the same sentence on the evening news. He will, however, be less pleased that it's now obvious what pond scum he finds himself associated with. These were the scenes in Westminster on Monday afternoon, which have now been viewed by millions.
Keep going, out of the way. Where we going? Out of the way. You know what it's doing. Out of the way. Protect your people. Protect your people.
So along with protesters telling Keir Starmer he should be hung, you heard them shout, "Why are you protecting paedophiles?" and just Jimmy Savile. Now, Speaker of the House Lindsay Hoyle was quick to draw a connection between Johnson's comments and the mob's actions.
I know it's been reported that some abuse was directed at the Right Honourable Member, the Leader of the Opposition yesterday, related to claims made by the Prime Minister in this chamber. But regardless of yesterday's incident, I made it clear last week that while the Prime Minister's words were not disorderly, they were inappropriate. As I said then, these sorts of comments only inflame opinions and generate disregard for the House, and it is not acceptable. Our words have consequences, and we should always be mindful of that fact.
Labour's Chris Bryant went further, and referred to the smear as being part of a deliberate strategy to stir up hatred.
Well, let's go through the precise time frame of it. So last Monday, the Prime Minister was in terrible problems because he knew that many Tory MPs were absolutely furious with him for all that had gone on in Downing Street, the chaos and the lying to Parliament. And so he had a conversation with his advisers before he came to the House of Commons, and somebody suggested perhaps that he would raise this matter, this conspiracy theory, which has normally come from the very far right. And his advisors said, no, you mustn't do it. That's not a proper way to proceed. And yet he deliberately did so. And to me, that's the key point here. It is deliberate. It's not accidental. It's an attempt to incite a mob, either online or physically in person. And the thing is, we know how this plays out when politicians go down this deeply cynical route, because we saw it in the United States of America. It's exactly the same as Donald Trump's playbook. It's profoundly dangerous. It's not the way we do politics in this country. It's so un-British.
In our next segment, we'll be disputing that last claim. For the Tories, that behaviour, far from being un-British, is at the heart of their politics. But Bryant's information is interesting. Johnson made the remark despite the advice of his advisers, and indeed we saw his chief adviser, Munira Mirza, quit over the smear. In a report, the Huffington Post found a Tory MP who seemed to confirm that the comment was pretty calculated. So the Huffington Post report, this wasn't something said off the cuff, this is something we know people are talking about, one Tory MP said. They claimed it had been mentioned on the doorstep during the Batley and Spend by-election last summer, and that Johnson knew what he was doing when he made the comment. They even suggested Conservative campaign HQ would be stockpiling stories on Starmer's time as Director of Public Prosecutions. I'd expect to see some more of this sort of thing in the run-up to the next general election, they added. Still, some Tory frontbenchers just refused to see any link between Johnson's smear and the mob that harassed Starmer. Here's Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Tech and the Digital Economy, Chris Philp, talking to Kay Burley.
I don't think you can make a link reasonably between what the Prime Minister said and the harassment and intimidation. This group of people there were talking about a number of things beyond, as well as Jimmy Savile. They're people who have harassed other public figures, including journalists, over the last year or two. So I don't think you can make that link.
And when it came to the journalists and when it came to other people that they were harassing, did they mention Jimmy Savile then?
Well, they mentioned all kinds of things, as they did last
Jimmy
night.
Savile, then?
Well, no, because that wasn't an issue at the time. But
exactly.
But the harassment.
Exactly.
But hang on, Kate. The harassment last night. They were talking about a whole number of things. They mostly talked about Julian Assange. If you listen to the entire clip, they were mostly going on about Julian Assange for some reason.
Kay Burley saying exactly. Very well done, I thought. Whatever Philp thinks or doesn't think, recent polling suggests that the country isn't buying it. So a Snap poll from Savanta Comres shows 69% of people say the Prime Minister is responsible for Keir Starmer being harassed. 54% of 2019 Conservative voters also say this. 68% of all people say he should publicly apologise to Starmer, or all those polled, sorry. And 68% said he should withdraw the comments. And 64% say politics has gotten nastier in the last 5 years. So overwhelming majority of the public there suggesting that Boris Johnson is to blame for Keir Starmer being harassed by people in the street, and an overwhelming majority saying he should withdraw the comments and publicly apologise. Dalia, do you think that sort of mob harassment of Keir Starmer and them repeating the words, essentially, that Boris Johnson used in Parliament, that he's someone who protects paedophiles, and then mentioning Jimmy Savile, do you think that has shown this stunt to have kind of backfired for the Prime Minister because he can't now distance himself from the sort of dark forces he was ultimately appealing to?
Well, this is a very classic strategy for right-wing politicians like Johnson. And we have to understand figures like him as part of quite a dangerous spectrum, because the strategy is, play up to certain kinds of respectability. So the liberal commentariat can kind of find excuses for you when they need to, whilst also giving just enough so that your far right base, you can call on them with legitimacy in times of need. And we saw this throughout the Trump presidency, although I think Trump made even fewer attempts to play up to any kind of respectability. But because of that, I don't think it will necessarily backfire, because it's not the act itself was not targeted towards people who would be disgusted by it, which is actually a majority of people, but rather it's meant to try and, in his moment of weakness, consolidate a very particular part of his base, a hard right base invested in this kind of conspiratorial thinking, which is, it's yes, very small, but it's very committed, and it has a role to play within the Conservative Party, and particularly the Conservative membership. And when Boris Johnson was in the race for Tory leadership, I went on Sky News and I made this argument that Boris Johnson was kind of proto-fascist. And at that time, the point that I was trying to make was that fascism doesn't start with people marching down the streets in uniform. It starts with the normalization and empowerment of far-right talking points in the mainstream. It starts with people who have material and political power, like Boris Johnson, calling on and relying on far-right political forces for their legitimacy in times of political crisis. That's when it becomes really dangerous. And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing him trying to consolidate himself during a moment of political weakness. And, he might not use these talking points every day. He doesn't always compare Muslim women to letterboxes or say derogatory things about people of the global South. But that implicit reliance and grooming of this logic and of this constituency, and relying on these weapons in his arsenal during those times of crisis, is why he's dangerous. And it's why Johnson always has been dangerous. And it's also, unfortunately, to look at it in a more short-term sense, just another example of Johnson acting with total impunity and irresponsibility and being motivated by nothing else but his own political survival, regardless of whatever kind of carnage or collateral damage that will cause. Much like the decision to prematurely end mandatory isolation before the scientific advice has properly come out in favor of that, regardless of what impact that might have, the deliberate deploying of this particular talking point is also, it's a way of trying to appeal to a key part and consolidate his base and recover power. But much like with the end to isolation rules, this isn't, what's at stake here is not just silly Westminster games. Like, what kind of irreparable damage could this cause? And for what? So that he can continue to be Prime Minister? And what this shows me is that the kind of very empty apologies and promises of change that we have heard over the past couple of weeks from Boris Johnson, this just goes to show that this leopard has not and will never change his ghastly and power-hungry spots. And so that's what we're seeing right now. And the reason that the question of backfiring is a difficult one is because, as I said, the target isn't us. The target isn't people that would hear this and be disgusted by it. The target is the particular faction within the Conservative base, within particularly the membership, that hold, that are part of this particular political milieu. That's the kind of the people that he's speaking to. So what they feel about it is really what matters, because a general election is far away. What he needs to do is consolidate his own personal coalition. So the question is, will it do that? And that kind of remains to be seen.
Marching in Manchester, fingers crossed it's good weather. There are protests across the country this weekend, this Saturday, about the cost of living, about fuel going up, and the Tories' absolutely pathetic response to it, which is to lend us all £200 instead of putting a windfall tax on all of the oil companies who are making, I think it's 14 billion for Shell, 10 billion for BP. This is money they didn't earn by hard work. This is money they earned because oil prices went up. So that's when you should have a windfall tax, not when you should lend everyone 200 quid. And I absolutely love this comment. Mishing Malesho with a £5. My mum, Betty Butcher, is 93 today. She watches you 3 times a week. Thinks she might be your oldest subscriber. Could you wish her a happy birthday? Betty Butcher, happy birthday. It's such an honour to have you watching 3 times a week. I'd also quite like to know if you are our oldest subscriber. If you're, I don't want to overshadow your birthday, but if you're older than 93, feel free to put that in the comments. But no, happy birthday, Betty Butcher. Straight on to our next story. When attacking Boris Johnson for his smear on Keir Starmer, Labour MPs have frequently suggested that the Prime Minister is a completely different kettle of fish to his Tory predecessors. This is Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting.
I don't know what's happened to the Conservative Party, but I'd say to Conservative colleagues across the House of Commons listening to your programme this afternoon, Theresa May wouldn't have behaved like this, David Cameron wouldn't have behaved like this, John Major wouldn't have behaved like this, Margaret Thatcher wouldn't have behaved like this. What has happened to the Conservative Party of Winston Churchill for a Conservative Party leader to ape and parrot far-right messages that led to the kind of behaviour that we saw yesterday? It's a total disgrace.
The direct blame, you would agree, I'm sure, lies with the mob who threatened your party leader.
The mob have to take responsibility for their actions, and the Prime Minister has to accept that his words have consequences. Okay. And Conservative MPs have to accept that his behaviour, in which they are complicit, reflects poorly on the Conservative Party, which is no longer the party of Winston Churchill, no longer the party of Mrs Thatcher. It's the party of a leader who apes and parrots far-right memes and rhetoric. What on earth has happened to the Conservative Party? I don't know. But I think Conservative MPs need to recognise on their shoulders.
You heard there Wes Streeting say that no other Tory leader would behave like Boris Johnson. They might have had policies Wes Streeting disagreed with, but unlike Johnson, they would not stoop so low as to smear the opposition. Well, that's not quite true. To remind ourselves, these are the leaders Streeting said would not behave like Johnson. So he tweeted that clip we just showed you saying Theresa May wouldn't behave like this, David Cameron wouldn't, John Major wouldn't, Margaret Thatcher wouldn't. And then he mentions that this is the party of Winston Churchill. We can go through all of those former prime ministers chronologically, starting with Sir Winston Churchill. Churchill, of course, served in a war cabinet with his opposite number, Clement Attlee, but that wasn't enough to stop him levelling spurious fear-mongering at the Labour leader. Launching the Tories' 1945 campaign, Churchill warned that there would be Gestapo in Britain if socialists win. Of course, Attlee's party, which Churchill was smearing, is the one that now every Labour MP claims as their inspiration. Attlee was the Prime Minister who founded our great national treasure, the NHS. Surely no Tory leader could have promoted lies to whip up fear against him, or no other leader other than Boris Johnson. Well, they did, and it was Winston Churchill. Next to Maggie Thatcher. Thatcher might not have explicitly claimed that her opposite number protected paedophiles. She did, however, claim Labour were protecting a group just as nefarious: gay kids. This 1987 poster reads, "Is this Labour's idea of comprehensive education?" It then shows a book titled Young, Gay and Proud. Heaven forbid queer kids learn not to be ashamed of themselves. In her defence, one thing that does separate Thatcher from Johnson is she wouldn't have used Savile as an attack line. Definitely not. That's only, though, because they were such close friends. John Major was also not afraid of scaremongering. In the lead up to the 1992 general election, he suggested increased immigration under Labour could lead to race riots. Then, in 1997, the Tories depicted Blair as a literal demon. The poster says, "New Labour, new danger." The danger presumably being the gates of hell opening after Labour introduced Sure Star or increased funding to hospitals. It was not a preemptive warning about subsequent illegal wars in the Middle East, which the Tories, of course, supported at the time. The next Tory Prime Minister loved a good smear. David Cameron said this about Jeremy Corbyn.
My friends, we cannot let that man inflict his security-threatening, terrorist-sympathising, Britain-hating ideology on this country we love.
Those smears were just as bad as what Boris Johnson threw at Keir Starmer. And unlike those smears thrown at leaders before Blair, they should be fresh in Wes Streeting's memory. This was all very recent. So you have to ask, why didn't those ones register for the Shadow Health Secretary? Well, probably because he was happy to go along with them at the time, making them all the more damaging, of course. Finally, Theresa May, her record tends to get airbrushed nowadays, but when she was leader, one of her backbenchers had to apologise for sending this tweet. "Corbyn sold British secrets to communist spies. Get some perspective, mate. Your priorities are a bit awry." Ben Bradley had to apologise for that after legal action was taken. And May's response to the whole ridiculous Czech spy meme was not to call it out. It was to lean into it. She encouraged Corbyn to be open about the ridiculous spy claims. Dalia, what was Wes Streeting thinking when he said that Boris Johnson is completely unlike any previous Tory leader and that we've never seen anything like this before?
I mean, career politicians like Wes Streeting are not here to think. They're here to play essentially what they see as a game. You know, that's what this entire thing is. And I think the points that you make are really important, particularly about the point with Jeremy Corbyn and how, you know, Wes Streeting was happy to go along with those kinds of smears and et cetera, et cetera. But I also think that there's another point here, which is this comment and the kind of moralizing of figures like Thatcher, of figures like Churchill, saying, you know, they would never stoop so low as to smear the opposition. It really shows me about, you know, a lot about what Streeting thinks is at stake here. You know, it speaks to this idea that politics it's just this sort of gentleman's game. And there's codes of conduct and there's these, you know, unwritten rules that are supposed to be followed. And the worst thing you could do is not follow those particular rules of decorum, etc. And in the case of Johnson, that code of conduct that he violated is, you know, smearing other members of the political class. You know, that's kind of very off limits. You know, that feels very personal. It feels like, oh, you know, we're playing a game of football here and you just, you know, picked up the ball and ran with it and chucked it into the goal. Like, that's not fair, or that's not what we agreed here. And so within that context, you know, the smearing of members of the opposition is something that he sees as more outlandish than he apparently sees as more outlandish and objectionable than the very material acts of, to be honest, you know, economic and social warfare that many of the politicians that he is giving sort of moral superiority to in that context, you know, that they have committed. You know, these kinds of policies, which are not just down with Tory politicians, but also have been Labour policy as well, particularly during the Blair years that Streeting is so fond of. Is seen as kind of you know, beside the point. You know, was Boris Johnson bringing up Savile in that context wrong? Absolutely, but was it as bad as misleading Parliament and the public into a war that killed 1 million Iraqis? No, but the latter is seen much more kind of abstractly and dispassionately than the smearing act. You know, which is taken much more personally. And it kind of reminds me a little bit, last week we talked about the just bizarreness of Ian Blackford and Dawn Butler being chucked out of Parliament for accusing Boris Johnson of lying, but Boris Johnson actually lying doesn't get him kicked out of Parliament. And even, to come back to this point as well about what this tells us about how politicians like Streeting view what politics is there to do and view what is at stake. Even within this particular context, like ignore all the historical stuff. The problem with what Johnson said, like the main problem with what Johnson said wasn't just smearing the reputation of Starmer. It was specifically, calling back to a far right talking point and emboldening a set of politics and signifying his own willingness to shift towards appealing to some of the most extreme parts of the Conservative coalition. That's what's really concerning, and that's what's at the forefront here, rather than the breaking of this gentleman's agreement in the smearing of a colleague. Obviously, Streeting did mention this, but it feels like his greatest passion is sort of reserved for that kind of, you smeared one of your own, and that's really the grave infraction here. And I just think it reveals a lot about what politicians like Streeting think is going on here, what they think is at stake, and what they think we're all here to do. Essentially, those of us who are interested in what's happening politically.
And Corbyn obviously wasn't one of their own, which I think is, I see what you're saying. Like, the policy is more meaningful than even however they treat Corbyn. But I do also think, that contrast is just so strong. He was fair game. Sir Keir Starmer isn't. I do think the Sir matters. Sir Keir Starmer is not fair game. And that's why this is completely unacceptable. It is unacceptable. It's unacceptable to make up stuff about someone in Parliament and to sort of spuriously connect your opponent with a notorious paedophile. But it's not out of the ordinary in British politics. We saw it happen to Corbyn for 4 or 5 years, and Wes Streeting, in more cases than not, joined in. We have a comment. Oliver Cant with a fiver. Centrist Liberals are more outraged by rudeness than injustice. There's quite a lot to that comment. I think you saw that. It's also interesting because it's interesting in terms of electoral strategy, because I can see why Wes Streeting would want to go on and say, Boris Johnson is completely different to Winston Churchill, because people do quite like Winston Churchill. He always gets voted Great Britain or whatever. You are trying to appeal to some Tory voters. So you are trying to appeal to some people who, maybe idolise Winston Churchill, maybe voted for Theresa May. And so you want to say you might have voted for those guys, but this guy's completely different. I get that. At the same time, I think there is a danger that some people watch it thinking these are just politicians talking about other politicians. They're talking about how politicians treat other politicians. This is incredibly abstract to me. You saw a sort of similar tension in sort of the Democratic Party's strategy in the US when Donald Trump was president. I think it's actually quite a complex one when it comes to electoral strategy. But I just have no sympathy for Wes Streeting because he joined in, when it was a different guy. Let's go to our next story. Sadiq Khan has revealed his fury over a recent report uncovering yet more evidence of gross misogyny, homophobia and racism in the Met. And he has finally pointed the finger at Met Commissioner Cressida Dick. Speaking on the Today programme, he demanded immediate action.
If I believe that the Commissioner can't win back the trust and confidence of Londoners, if I believe that the Commissioner doesn't understand and doesn't have a plan to root out what is clearly racist, sexist, misogynistic, unprofessional behaviour.
To come up with a plan then, is that what you're saying? Because in relation to Wayne Couzens, there's the Louise Casey review underway. Are you essentially saying that this is a Macpherson-style moment and it needs that kind of response?
It's more profound. Let me tell you why.
More profound than Macpherson, which was a finding of institutional racism.
Macpherson took 2 years at the public inquiry, then another year to come up with his 70-plus recommendations. Louise Casey has started her report this week. She'll take a number of months to come up with her recommendations and to look into what's going on in the police service. The investigation being conducted on behalf of the Home Secretary. The nationwide investigation will take a number of months. We can't wait. Let me tell you why I say we can't wait. We police in this country upon a very important principle of one of consent. If it is the case that Londoners, whether you're a woman or a girl, whether you're a person of colour or you're a member of the LGBTQ plus community, haven't got confidence in the police service to come forward when you're a victim of crime, to come forward when you're a witness of crime, to come forward and join the police service. That's a problem for now.
Sadiq Khan was speaking a week after an investigation revealed groups of police officers had traded deeply offensive, misogynist, racist and homophobic messages on WhatsApp and Facebook. An independent office for police conduct found that messages exchanged between 2016 and 2018 in groups of up to 19 officers, mainly based at Charing Cross Police Station, amounted to bullying and harassment. The messages are absolutely vile. A warning, they make reference to rape, violence against women and killing children. We're going to show you some of them now. So some of the messages which were revealed was one police officer who wrote this: "Getting a woman into bed is like spreading butter. It can be done with a bit of effort using a credit card, but it's quicker and easier just to use a knife." It's a message from a Metropolitan police officer. Another sent this: "My dad kidnapped some African children and used them to make dog food." A male officer sent these 3 messages to a female officer: "I would happily rape you. If I was single, I would actually hate fuck you. If I was single, I would happily chloroform you." So that's messages sent by a male officer to a female officer. And then we have a conversation between 2 officers. So you've got Officer 1: "I effing need to take my bird out. Won't see her until next Saturday. Then I have to work. Promise to take her out the Friday after, making it up to her from when I backhanded her." Then Officer 2 says, "Grab her by the pussy." Officer 1 says, "You ever slapped your missus?" And then Officer 1 says, "It makes them love you more. Seriously, since I did that, she won't leave me alone. Now I know why these daft," and the C words, "are getting murdered by their spastic boyfriends." Apologies for the language here, but I think it is important to read this all out. "Knock a bird about and she will love you. Human nature, they are biologically programmed to like that shit." Then Officer 2 says, "Lamau," and Officer 1 says, "I'm right though." These are just some of the horrific, I mean, I'm sure you were genuinely shocked by those messages. These are just some of the many, many horrific messages uncovered by the IOPC. Following that report, Cressida Dick apologised, saying there is no place in the Met for the appalling behaviour displayed by officers at Charing Cross Police Station. Their conduct does not represent our values, and I am deeply sorry to everyone. They have failed. Those words might sound nice enough, but they do ring pretty hollow when we consider the fact that just 4 of the 14 officers involved in circulating those messages were sacked, 1 resigned. Unbelievably, the remaining 9 are still serving and 2 have been promoted. Empty apologies have, of course, now become Dick's specialism. Here are a few more recent examples.
"I recognise that for some people, a precious bond of trust has been damaged.
If those officers' actions have added to the families unimaginable distress, then I apologise from the bottom of my heart. And I don't rule out in this case. And as I said, my senior officer has I didn't say this, but she said, "I'm sorry to Ms. Williams for the distress it has clearly caused her." And I say that too. I have the deepest feelings for Daniel Morgan's family. They have shown extraordinary grit and determination and courage. And yesterday I apologised again to them for our failings.
I should say the graphic was slightly confusing there. Obviously, Cressida Dick didn't say those things on the 9th of February. That was a compilation of things she said in recent months, which was aired on the 9th of February, this morning. You heard there Dick apologising for 4 incidents. The first was the police response to the murder of Sarah Everard. Sarah Everard was kidnapped, raped and murdered by a serving Met police officer. Then when women held a vigil in her memory, they were treated like criminals by the police. The second apology was for the events following the murders of Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry. Their bodies were found by family members after police had been slow to initiate a search. Once the police did turn up, 2 officers took pictures of the dead bodies. The photos were then doctored and shared with other officers on WhatsApp. The third apology you heard was for the stop and search of athlete Bianca Williams, who has won gold for Britain at the Commonwealth Games. Williams was stopped by the police while in a car with her partner and 3-month-old baby. 3 of the officers involved are under investigation for gross misconduct. That final apology followed the results of an independent inquiry into the 1987 murder of private detective Daniel Morgan. That revealed extensive police corruption, including attempts by Cressida Dick herself to interfere in and obstruct the inquiry. So how did Khan respond to all of these failures? Well, in July 2021, just days after the Daniel Morgan report was released and 3 months after Everard's murder, Khan said this in response to Andrew Marr.
Do you have faith in Cressida Dick, or should she resign?
I've got faith in Cressida Dick. I've got full confidence in Cressida Dick.
Khan would go on to support a 2-year extension of Dick's term as head of the Metropolitan Police. So why this sudden change of heart? Khan has now said that Dick is on notice and has a matter of days to give him a satisfactory plan for how she will handle this latest scandal.
So what happens if she does not come back with what you consider a good enough response on both of the fronts that you've talked about in days and weeks, which is the time frame you've outlined?
Well, look, I'm not talking hypotheticals, but if it was the case, anybody who works for me hasn't got my trust and confidence. More importantly, hasn't got the trust and confidence of Londoners. I wouldn't keep silent about that. I'd take action.
So what happened? What changed? Did Khan suddenly realise he was wasting good political capital on defending his police chief? The WhatsApp messages are disgusting, that's for sure, but does Khan really think they're worse than the Sarah Everard case or the Daniel Morgan corruption findings or the treatment Koshka Duff received or the Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman murders? Why this sudden change now? Dalia, help us out here. What's going on? Why has the tone we're hearing from Sadiq Khan suddenly changed so dramatically?
Well, what's going on is that thanks to a broader movement, social movement that is taking place to increase scrutiny of and question the unbridled power that is wielded in this country by the police, we've created the space for a rigorous and proper conversation around the concrete evidence that we now have an insight into what has always been true. It's really important to understand that this kind of ideology is something that has existed throughout the history of the Met Police. And that's why we cannot blame it on just a few rotten apples. It's far too historically continuous for that. And specifically, this kind of dehumanizing and demeaning ideology that is held by the police, particularly towards communities that are over-policed, so people of color, working class people, women, these are things that, are ideologies that those over-policed communities have always known existed, have always tried to ring the alarm on it and have been systematically ignored. And so you asked that important question, which is why now? We have known what the Met Police is. We have known specifically who Cressida Dick is. We saw it in her role in the murder of Jean-Charles de Menezes. We saw it in her role in, as you outlined, with Daniel Morgan, in the Sarah Everard protest, all of that. And it's important to mention that, Cressida Dick is not an outlier. That is she's sort of fulfilling the role that the commissioner of the Met Police holds. My answer to why now would be we've got a movement. I think that we have seen such a vibrant and multiracial, cross-geographical movement that has forced into the public conversation a genuine and far overdue conversation about the role that police is given in our society and the nature of the institution as an institution of state violence. Kill the Bill, Black Lives Matter. These are some of the largest protest movements that we have seen in recent history in this country, with the exception of maybe the climate movement. And the message is very clear. We do not want our communities over-policed anymore. We do not want to endow the police with the amount of power that they have. And we do not want the police to be deployed to deal with social problems. And because we know that this is how our community members are treated by the police, and because we know that they do not keep us safe, and in fact, they actually oftentimes put us in danger, these are the reasons why we are making these demands and why we are seeing these movements coalesce at this moment. And so this has created a situation and created the political space for Sadiq Khan to come out against the police commissioner, something that would have been unthinkable not that long ago. This isn't the first time that Sadiq Khan has been presented with evidence that there's something wrong in the Met Police. It's just that now the political climate has changed and space has been created by ordinary people in order to make it so that he is able to make a statement like that and place that kind of pressure on him. And I think that this is a really important example when we think about how social change happens. And I think specifically on the issue of policing, it's a really good example because, if you cast your mind back to the Corbyn leadership, the Corbyn leadership changed the conversation on many different issues in society and on the economy. But they always remained very conservative on the issue of policing. It was seen as a no-go topic. In fact, they often actually talked about increasing funding to the police under the banner of an anti-austerity politics. And they rightfully attracted criticism from minority communities for doing that. It was seen as a kind of comms suicide to criticize the police just, not that long ago, just a few years ago. And especially to criticize the police from the position of the left and from the position of racial justice. And yet within 6 months of Jeremy Corbyn losing the general election, we see apparently this issue that is so stigmatized and that will lose so much popularity, we saw it galvanize one of the biggest cross-generational, cross-geographic, diverse movements, street movements that we have seen with the demands to reduce police power and hold police accountable. So how did this thing that became that was unimaginable, even within the context of a political movement of Corbynism that questioned a lot of social and political and economic orthodoxies, how did that suddenly become imaginable? And it didn't come from, the right comms from the people in power. It came from a mobilized and organized demonstration of power, of people power on the streets, in public discourse, in media, and within our communities. And so this just tells me that in so many in so many cases, we shouldn't see ourselves as constantly having to triangulate those in power, but rather we actually do have the power in many contexts, especially when we speak with moral clarity, to lead politicians like Khan rather than be led by them. So I think that's why at this moment we are seeing that shift at the top.
Boris Johnson has attempted to shore up his premiership by promoting a bunch of wrong-uns. It's all an effort to try to get his MPs back on side. I'll take you through the key hires. The new Chief Whip is Chris Heaton-Harris. As Chief Whip, his job will be to enforce discipline among unruly Tory MPs. That's a little ironic, given he was previously caught bragging about encouraging a friend to launch a campaign against the Tories in a 2012 by-election.
I'm running the policy by-election for the Tories.
And Delhi poll
was my constituent. Very good friend. Well, she had all the said the people doesn't matter about that.
Right.
It's part of the plan. You went to realistic people, the independent people, and they said, "Oh, because you step in part of your job."
And he's getting attention.
You see the job. It's one of those rare jobs, which has been a very please don't tell anybody but he will not be putting his deposit.
That footage was recorded secretly by Greenpeace. Heaton-Harris explains in the clip that he encouraged his friend James Delingpole to threaten to stand in the constituency in order to get opposition to wind farms up the political agenda. Delingpole is a notorious climate skeptic and former editor at Breitbart UK. You can see what kind of guy Heaton-Harris is. Heaton-Harris will have as his deputy Chris Pincher. Pincher is accused of having a particularly aggressive strategy to get MPs to vote his way. In 2019, he was accused of trying to get dirt on Johnny Mercer from one of Mercer's former army colleagues. When the colleague told Johnny Mercer of the approach, the Whip's office were forced to apologise. One man leaving the Whip's office is Mark Spencer. He has moved to become leader of the Commons. In that role, he will have oversight over the parliamentary complaints process, which has raised eyebrows, given he is the subject of a racism allegation by Nazgani MP. He is reported to have told her she was demoted because her, quote, Muslim woman minister status was making colleagues feel uncomfortable. Spencer will replace Jacob Rees-Mogg, who will move to become Minister for Brexit Opportunities and Government Efficiency, or the Bogey Minister. In 2019, Rees-Mogg caused controversy by retweeting a speech from the far-right German Alternative for Deutschland. I'm sure he will have no problem engaging with the Social Democrats, who now run Europe's largest economy. One clear winner from the reshuffle is Michael Ellis. He's been promoted from Paymaster General to Minister at the Cabinet Office. Ellis was the MP who stood in for Boris Johnson at the dispatch box after it was revealed Johnson had attended a lockdown party with 100 invitees. This is presumably his reward for taking that hit. We also have a new housing minister. He's Stuart Andrew. In 2016, Andrew voted against an amendment requiring rental properties be fit for human habitation, and he has no background in housing policy. He is, however, a landlord. I have just two more characters for you. Leah Nicky has been appointed a Parliamentary Private Secretary, or PPS, to Boris Johnson. She was elected in 2019 to represent Great Grimsby and gave this interesting defence of Boris Johnson's Savile slur on Radio 5 last week.
I have to say, actually, on Friday when Sir Keir popped up in Grimsby, the social media in Grimsby for local people was absolutely and utterly the number one issue for people, saying, why is he coming here? We don't want him. We don't want him to be the Labour Party leader. He did this with the CPS. He should be ashamed, that was a huge shock.
Was that after PMQs? Not PMQs. Was that after Boris Johnson had said this, that they were saying?
It was before. It was on Friday before. Before he said that. Yeah.
People on the street, on the doorstep in Grimsby, were all going on about Jimmy Savile.
They were. Absolutely. And that shocked me, but people had not forgotten about that. And people were saying, we don't want that person as the Labour Party leader, and we certainly don't want him to
Jimmy
be
Savile
the next
was
Prime Minister.
Essentially the talk of the town last Friday.
Yes, absolutely.
That is the kind of performance that gets you promoted in the current Conservative Party. Also elected in 2019, we have new PPS, Joy Morrissey. She caused controversy in December when she publicly attacked Chris Whitty. That was in response to Whitty's advice that people prioritise contexts that matter. So in response to that, she tweeted, perhaps the unelected COVID public health spokesperson should defer to what our elected members of Parliament and the Prime Minister have decided. I know it's difficult to remember, but that's how democracy works. This is not a public health socialist state. Remember, that tweet was prompted not by any new rules that anyone had laid down, but simply for Chris Whitty asking a question at a Downing Street press conference where they said, given Omicron's around, would you advise people to maybe think about which events they think are most important to go to? And he was like, yeah. And now she thinks that's the sign of a public health socialist state. Dalia, do you think this is the team that will save Boris Johnson's premiership?
I mean, it sits within the context. This decision to promote this sort of motley crew sits within the decision that we've discussed throughout the show, which is him turning to the hardest parts of his faction within the Conservative base in order to appeal to them, in order to try and consolidate his power within the party. It's the same logic that led him to end isolation rules early. It's the same logic behind the Savile slur. It's clear that this is part and parcel of a broader strategy. It's not haphazard. It's not gaffes. It's not accidental. And when we look at, with these particular figures, we are seeing, him essentially cranking up the culture war to its maximum and finding the foot soldiers that will most happily go out and pursue that and push that button and sort of play that angle up. And that alongside their loyalty to Johnson in this moment is why they've been promoted. But it's also perhaps because these are the only people with nothing really to lose in terms of their political reputation by joining Johnson when he's this unpopular. And, we have to, when we think about will this save his premiership, we have to ask, save his premiership from who? We have to remember that, we are several years out from a general election. That's not really on the purview right now. Whilst general public opinion matters, of course, the more urgent issue for Johnson right now is the prospect of a leadership challenge, which will be adjudicated by Conservative Party members. And so that's what's going to be in his crosshairs. That's what's going to be in his focus. And that's his audience right now. And so that's the question that we should be asking, not will this save his premiership in the eyes of the public, but will it save his premiership in the eyes of the factions of the Tory base that he needs to come out and back him and vote for him in the case of a leadership challenge? And that's a much trickier question that I can't say I necessarily have the answer to, because I can't say that I know what they are thinking and I know what they're sort of how they're receiving what we're seeing right now. But that's the strategy he's deploying, and it's probably the only strategy that could work. And so when you look at it that way, it becomes a bit clearer as to why he would do something that to most of us looks like a kind of bizarre move if you're trying to become more likable or recover your reputation amongst the general public. That's not really what's happening here. Boris Johnson is in survival mode, and he's in survival mode with the Conservative Party membership, the Conservative Party base. That's his audience right now. And so within that context, it's a much blurrier question about whether or not that call will work. Because, we're not talking about the general public, which I think are looking at this and thinking, oh, he's just going further down the rabbit hole. He's really not helping himself. But we're not the ones that have the power to decide at this point whether or not he's going to get what he wants, because we're not Conservative Party members.
You know who I feel sorry for in all of this? Michael Fabricant. Because we've just shown you all of these sort of non-entities, Conservative backbenchers who suddenly got promoted because they were willing to go on the radio and say something ridiculous in Boris Johnson's defence, like Keir Starmer and Jimmy Savile was the number one issue in Grimsby before Boris Johnson mentioned it at PMQs, and therefore he was right to remember it, because people don't forget. Forget what? The whole point of this story is that there's not really much to remember. There's not much substance to it. But Michael Fabricant, of all of them, went on and I think really gave it his all. You watched that, it was sort of like, I felt like almost, you're watching a kid do their pantomime at school and you're thinking, this might be rubbish, it might be nonsense, might be totally unconvincing, but they are really giving this their all. And he got nothing. They could have at least made it a PPS, something like that, give him a made up job, but he's out in the cold, did all of that for nothing.
Yeah. Imagine being a liability at this moment. How absurd do you have to be considered a liability in this absolute sea of liability that is Boris Johnson's premiership right now? Like, that is, it's embarrassing. But I don't think that a man like that has shame, so he's fine, I'm sure.
Yes, you've got Boris. Sorry, Michael Fabricant. Now's the time for the big guns. This is sort of a Nadine Dorries moment. Everything's pretty sensitive right now. Maybe we'll promote you when things have quietened down a little bit. Dalia, it's been wonderful spending the evening with you today. Slightly longer show than usual.
I would never complain. The longer I get to spend with you guys, the better.
And if you do complain, wait until the show has ended. Otherwise, it'd be awkward. Thank you so much for watching Tysky Sour tonight. We'll be back on Friday at 7 p.m. Always takes me a while to remember what day of the week it is. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.